I can't believe Star Trek. The Next Generation made the same mistake with Kirk and Spock. When Star Trek, The Next Generation first aired in 1987, it promised to boldly take Gene Roddenberry's optimistic vision of the future into a brand new era. Gone were the rough and tumble days of James T. Kirk throwing punches at lizard men or Spock raising an eyebrow at human irrationality. Instead, we got Captain Jean-Luc Picard, the thoughtful diplomat, Commander William Riker, the adventurous first officer, and an ensemble cast that represented a more balanced, cooperative Starfleet crew. The series wanted to distance itself from the classic Kirk-Spock-McCoy dynamic and chart its own course. And yet, despite all its efforts, The Next Generation ultimately stumbled into the very same storytelling trap that plagued the original series, leaning far too heavily on a central captain-first officer relationship at the expense of everyone else. In a way, Picard and Riker became TNG's Kirk and Spock, overshadowing the rest of the bridge crew, even when the writers clearly wanted to emphasize the idea of an ensemble cast. It's almost shocking to realize that after 2 decades of reflecting on the original series' flaws, TNG still couldn't quite shake this pattern. Let's dig into why this mistake happened, how it echoed Kirk and Spock, and why it matters so much to Star Trek storytelling as a whole. The original series' brilliant but lopsided dynamic. There's no denying that Kirk and Spock are one of television's greatest duos. Their friendship, tested across countless star systems, wars, and philosophical debates, has become the stuff of pop culture legend. Add in Dr. McCoy, and yet an iconic triad that could argue about morality, logic, and instinct all within a single scene. But the problem with this brilliance was that everyone else became window dressing. Uhura, Sulu, Chekhov, and Scotty all had their moments, but they were rarely central to the drama. In fact, most episodes could have been written with just Kirk, Spock, and McCoy without fundamentally changing the plot. That's why when The Next Generation was conceived, Roddenberry emphasized an ensemble approach. He wanted the new Enterprise to feel like a real community. Each character would have distinct responsibilities and arcs. Data would explore humanity. Worf would represent the outsider's struggle for acceptance. Troy would bring empathy into Starfleet decision-making. Geordi would be the innovative engineer. Crusher and Wesley would explore family aboard a starship. And Picard, unlike Kirk, wouldn't be the swaggering adventurer. He'd be the steady, intellectual leader who trusted his crew to shine. At least, that was the idea. Enter Picard and Riker, the new power duo. From the pilot episode Encounter at Farpoint, it was clear that Picard and Riker were set up as a dual leadership core. Riker, written as more action-oriented, was the Kirk archetype, a man who would leap into danger, get his hands dirty, and sometimes flirt his way out of trouble. Picard, by contrast, was cerebral, preferring diplomacy, philosophy, and strategy over fistfights. Together, they mirrored Kirk and Spock in surprising ways. Riker embodied the passion and intuition, while Picard embodied intellect and restraint. When the two debated on the bridge or in the ready room, it recalled the classic Kirk-Spock clashes about logic versus instinct, only now reframed as experience versus youth. The writers leaned into this dynamic so often that the show, in its early years especially, sidelined others. Data, Worf, and Troy might contribute an insight here or there, but major decisions usually boiled down to Picard and Riker hashing things out. Even Geordi, who became chief engineer, was often relegated to simply reporting on the warp core rather than driving the story. And just like TOS, this wasn't necessarily bad storytelling. It created a strong emotional anchor for the audience. But it was exactly the mistake Roddenberry wanted to avoid. The ensemble, that wasn't. If you compare TNG's first 3 seasons with its later ones, you can actually see the course correction happening. Early episodes like The Last Outpost, The Neutral Zone, or The Child lean so heavily on Picard and Riker that the rest of the crew feel like guests in their own series. It wasn't until Season 3, once writers like Michael Piller came aboard, that characters like Worf, Troy, and especially Data began to claim more narrative space. Suddenly, episodes like The Bonding, The Enemy, and The Offspring proved that audiences were just as invested in these characters as they were in Picard and Riker. But even then, the shadow of the central duo loomed large. The series finale, All Good Things, makes this clear. It's essentially Picard's story, with Riker as his loyal second. Everyone else orbits around that core. The TNG films doubled down even harder, transforming Picard into a quasi-Kirk action hero and leaving Riker as his Spock-like conscience and counterpart. The ensemble never quite escaped that gravitational pull. Why the mistake happened again? So why did the next generation repeat history? 1. Television tradition. 1980s network TV still believed in strong lead characters. The captain had to be central, no matter what. 2. Actor chemistry. Patrick Stewart and Jonathan Frakes had phenomenal chemistry, much like Shatner and Nimoy. Writers naturally leaned into that dynamic because it worked so well on screen. 3. Storytelling comfort zones. Star Trek thrives on dualities, logic versus instinct, diplomacy versus action, science versus faith. It's far easier to dramatize those through 2 characters rather than an ensemble of 7. 4. Audience expectation. Viewers were already primed by TOS to expect a captain-first officer pairing. Even if Roddenberry wanted to avoid it, fans responded most strongly when TNG delivered it. In other words, TNG didn't intend to repeat Kirk and Spock, but television gravity pulled it there anyway. Why it matters. At first glance, you might wonder if this is really such a mistake. After all, Kirk and Spock are beloved, and Picard and Riker are just as iconic. Doesn't that mean it worked? Yes and no. It worked in the sense that TNG became a hit and cemented itself as one of the greatest sci-fi series of all time. But it also limited Star Trek's ability to truly innovate. The whole point of TNG was to showcase a collective vision of the future, a starship crew that functioned like a family, where everyone's contribution mattered equally. By letting Picard and Riker eclipse the rest, the show diluted that radical vision. It also created a problem for future spin-offs. Deep Space Nine managed to break the mold by scattering focus across a sprawling ensemble. But Voyager and Enterprise fell into the same trap, often leaning too much on Janeway/Chakotay or Archer/Topol while their ensembles struggled for attention. The Kirk-Spock gravitational pull lingered long after Roddenberry was gone. A legacy of duos. To be fair, Star Trek has always thrived on pairings. Kirk and Spock, Picard and Riker, O'Brien and Bashir, Janeway and Seven, Archer and Topol, Burnham and Saru. Even in Strange New Worlds, Pike and Spock anchor the show. There's something fundamentally compelling about Star Trek duos. It's how the franchise explores human contrasts. But the danger lies in letting those duos dominate to the point where the ensemble promise gets lost. Star Trek is at its best when every character has a chance to shine, not just when 2 carry the narrative. That's why episodes like The Inner Light, Picard's story, The Measure of a Man, Data's story, and Sins of the Father, Worf's story remain so powerful. They break away from the duo template and prove the richness of the full cast. Looking back with fresh eyes, today, nearly 40 years after TNG's debut, it's easier to see how history repeated itself. The series succeeds